The dashboard camera flickers to life, its grainy black and white footage capturing the rhythmic sweep of windshield wipers against a light drizzle. It's March 3, 1972, just past 1 o'clock in the morning, and Officer Ray Shockey is driving his patrol route along Riverside Drive in Loveland, Ohio. His headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the wet asphalt that winds alongside the Little Miami River. The camera captures the gentle curve of the road ahead, the dense tree line pressing in from both sides. And then, in the center of the frame, something moves. Officer Shockey's brake lights flare red. The patrol car slows. And there, crouched on the road in a position no animal should occupy, is something watching him. It's roughly 4 feet tall, covered in leathery skin, with a face that witnesses would later struggle to describe without their voices faltering. The creature's eyes reflect the headlights for just a moment before it rises to a standing position, balanced on 2 legs, and moves with disturbing purpose toward the guardrail. Within seconds, it has vanished over the side, down toward the river below. This wasn't a campfire story passed down through generations. This wasn't folklore from some distant, superstitious past. This was 1972, the age of moon landings and color television, and it was witnessed by a sworn police officer with years of training in observation and reporting. Officer Shockey would file an official report that night, describing what he'd seen in careful, measured language that betrayed his own disbelief. But here's what makes the Loveland Frogmen different from countless other cryptid tales that fade into obscurity. 2 weeks later, another police officer would have his own encounter on that same stretch of road, and he too would file a report. And the creature he described would match, in an unsettling detail, what Officer Shockey had seen. Over the decades that followed, 5 significant encounters would be documented along the Little Miami River, each adding another layer to a mystery that refuses to dissolve into simple explanation. We're going to examine each of these sightings, walking you through the testimony of the witnesses, the investigations that followed, and the questions that remain unanswered. Some of these encounters ended with evidence. Some ended with gunfire. And some ended with witnesses who would never drive that stretch of road at night again. The Little Miami River still flows through Loveland today, sliding beneath old concrete bridges, cutting through patches of woods that have never been fully explored. And on certain nights, when the fog rolls in from the water and settles across Riverside Drive, locals choose different routes home. Because whatever Officer Shockey saw in his headlights that March night may have never left. And the dark spaces beneath those bridges might still hold something that's been waiting, patient, and cold-blooded, for the next set of headlights to illuminate its presence once more. The road stretched empty ahead, a ribbon of aging asphalt cutting through the Kentucky darkness in the early hours before dawn. It was sometime in the spring of 1955, that peculiar moment in American history when the nation balanced precariously between post-war optimism and atomic anxiety, when men in gray flannel suits built suburban dreams while nuclear nightmares lurked just beneath the surface of collective consciousness. A businessman whose name has been lost to time, or perhaps deliberately withheld, guided his car along Route 60 toward Louisville. The exact details of his identity remain frustratingly vague in the historical record, though this anonymity itself tells us something important about the era and the nature of what he was about to experience. In 1955, a man of business, a respectable citizen with a mortgage and a reputation, had everything to lose by claiming to see something impossible. The car's headlights pushed weakly against the darkness as he approached the North River Road area, where a bridge crossed over the water. He had made this drive countless times before, commuting between one ordinary American city and another, his mind likely occupied with the usual concerns of a working man in the Eisenhower era. Sales figures perhaps, quarterly reports, the persistent worry about Soviet expansion that newspapers hammered into the public consciousness day after day. Then his headlights caught something that should not have been there. Under the bridge, in that liminal space where concrete met earth and shadow pooled thickest, 3 figures stood motionless. The businessman's foot found the brake pedal, and his car slowed to a crawl, then stopped entirely. Later, trying to explain his decision to remain there rather than accelerate away immediately, he would struggle to articulate why he stayed. Curiosity, perhaps, or that peculiar paralysis that sometimes accompanies the deeply strange, when the mind refuses to process what the eyes insist they are seeing. The figure stood between 3 and 4 feet tall. Not children, his mind told him immediately. The proportions were wrong for children. These beings possessed a stocky, compressed quality, as if someone had taken human anatomy and redesigned it according to different specifications entirely. Their skin, visible even in the uncertain light, had a quality he described as leathery, reminiscent of reptiles or amphibians rather than mammals. But it was their faces that locked his attention and would haunt his memory for years to come. Frog-like, he would later say, though that simple descriptor hardly captured the unsettling reality of what he claimed to witness. The wide-set eyes, the broad, lipless mouths, features that suggested something aquatic, primordial, utterly other. These were not faces that belonged in 1955 America, the land of drive-in theaters and television dinners, of conformity and carefully manicured lawns. The businessman sat in his idling car, engine rumbling softly, watching these impossible creatures watch him back. Minutes passed. How many exactly, he could never say with certainty. Time becomes elastic in moments of high strangeness, stretching and compressing in ways that defy the steady ticking of watches. 2 minutes might have felt like 10, while 5 minutes might have compressed into what seemed like seconds. The beings did not flee. They did not attack. They simply stood there beneath the bridge, regarding the automobile and its occupant with what appeared to be calm curiosity, as if they had every right to be there and were mildly interested in this intrusion by a human traveler. Then one of them raised something. In the businessman's account, later shared with researchers who managed to track down fragments of his story, he described it as a wand or rod of some kind. The object had a manufactured quality, he insisted, not a stick picked up from the ground, but something crafted with purpose. The being held it aloft, and the rod began to emit sparks. Not sparks like those from a campfire or a cigarette lighter. These sparks had a strange quality, he would say, struggling with vocabulary insufficient to capture what he had seen. They cascaded from the tip of the rod in colors that seemed slightly wrong, slightly off from the spectrum he knew. The sparks fell through the darkness beneath the bridge, illuminating the 3 figures in bursts of uncanny light. What was this device? A tool? A weapon? A communication device of some kind? The businessman had no framework for understanding what he was witnessing. This was 1955, years before Star Trek would make ray guns and alien technology part of popular culture's furniture. The space age had barely begun. Sputnik would not orbit for another 2 years. The vocabulary for describing encounters with the impossible had not yet been written. We must pause here to consider the profound strangeness of this moment in its historical context. This was the Cold War, an era when conformity was not merely encouraged, but enforced through social pressure and genuine fear. McCarthyism had recently torn through American institutions, destroying careers and lives on mere suspicion of communist sympathy. To be different, to be unusual, to claim something outlandish was to risk everything. A businessman in 1955 occupied a specific social position. He was expected to be rational, practical, grounded in the material world of profit and loss, of measurable, quantifiable reality. To claim you had seen 3 creatures with frog-like faces and leathery skin, wielding rods that shot sparks beneath a bridge on a Kentucky highway, was to mark yourself as mentally unstable, possibly dangerous, certainly unemployable. The Soviet Union was the enemy because it represented chaos, irrationality, a threat to the American order. Anything that suggested reality was not what it appeared to be, that the world contained mysteries beyond the reach of science and reason, carried a whiff of that same dangerous chaos. To see impossible things was almost un-American. And yet this businessman saw what he saw, or believed he saw it, strongly enough that fragments of his account survived despite his apparent determination to remain anonymous. He told someone, perhaps a friend he trusted deeply, perhaps a family member who listened with growing concern and urged him to keep silent, perhaps a researcher or journalist who promised discretion. The terror came later, he would say. In the moment, watching the creature manipulate its spark-emitting rod, he felt caught in a kind of dreamlike suspension, observing something his mind could not quite accept as real. But when one of the other creatures began to move, Stepping forward from the shadows beneath the bridge, the spell broke. Fear flooded through him with the force of ice water. His hands, which had been gripping the steering wheel in frozen attention, suddenly responded to his will again. His foot found the accelerator. The car lurched forward, tires complaining against the pavement, as he fled from that bridge and the impossible things that stood beneath it. He did not look back. He drove through the remainder of the night and into the dawn, putting distance between himself and whatever he had witnessed. When the sun rose and transformed the world back into something familiar and safe, when other cars appeared on the road and the landscape took on the ordinary quality of day, he began the process that so many witnesses to high strangeness undergo. He questioned his own senses. Had he been more tired than he realized? Had some trick of shadow and light created an illusion? Could 3 children playing under the bridge have been transformed by exhaustion and poor visibility into something monstrous? But the details resisted these rational explanations. The leathery skin, the proportions of the bodies, the frog-like faces, and most of all, the device, the wand or rod that emitted those strange sparks in colors that did not belong to any electrical phenomenon he knew. He carried this experience with him, a secret burden, a memory that would not fade or rationalize itself into comfortable explanations. In an era before widespread belief in alien abductions, before television shows and movies would make close encounters part of cultural conversation, he had no template for understanding what he might have seen. Were these creatures extraterrestrial visitors? The 1950s would soon become the golden age of flying saucer sightings, but in 1955, that phenomenon was still nascent. Were they remnants of some earlier human civilization, living in hidden places beneath bridges and in remote locations? Were they interdimensional travelers, spirits, cryptids unknown to science? Or had this businessman, tired from a late-night drive, witnessed something his mind constructed from shadows and suggestion, a hallucination so vivid it felt more real than reality itself? The question remains unanswered. The businessman returned to his life, presumably carried on with his work, his routine, his place in the orderly world of 1950s America. But somewhere in his memory, 3 figures stood eternally beneath a bridge, watching him with their wide-set eyes, one of them holding aloft a rod that threw sparks of impossible colors into the darkness. What did he actually witness that night on a lonely Kentucky highway? What stood beneath that bridge in the early morning hours, unafraid of being seen, manipulating technology that produced effects he could not explain? The truth died with the unnamed businessman, or perhaps remains locked in memories he took to his grave, too strange to share, too persistent to forget. We are left only with the fragments of his account, the bare bones of an encounter that suggests reality may be far stranger than the orderly world we construct to contain our fears. The call came in just after midnight on March 3, 1972 at 2. Officer Ray Shockey was the first to respond, his patrol car cutting through the darkness along Riverside Drive in Loveland, Ohio. The radio crackled with his voice, measured but urgent. He needed backup. Something was on the road ahead of him, something he couldn't quite explain. When Officer Mark Williams received that transmission, he had no idea he was about to file one of the most controversial police reports in Ohio history. Williams knew Shockey well. They'd worked together for years, handled domestic disputes, traffic accidents, the occasional break-in. Shockey wasn't the type to call for backup over nothing. He wasn't prone to exaggeration or jumping at shadows. So when Williams pulled his cruiser onto that dark stretch of road, his headlights sweeping across the guardrail near the Little Miami River, he expected to find something unusual. Maybe a large animal. Maybe someone having a medical emergency. What he did not expect was to see what appeared to be a creature from someone's nightmare crouched at the side of the road. The thing was small, perhaps 3 to 4 feet tall, hunched low near the white painted guardrail. In the beam of Williams' spotlight, its skin appeared leathery, with a texture that reminded him of amphibian flesh. Not the smooth, wet surface of a fish, but something rougher, almost wrinkled in places. The head was wrong, all wrong for any animal Williams had ever encountered in his years of patrol. It was broad and flat, with what he would later describe in his official report as frog-like characteristics. But frogs didn't grow to 3 feet tall. Frogs didn't crouch by roadsides in the middle of winter in Ohio. Williams brought his vehicle to a stop approximately 30 feet from the creature. His training kicked in automatically. Assess the threat. Identify the subject. Determine appropriate response. But how do you assess something that shouldn't exist? The creature's eyes caught the light, reflecting it back with an unnatural gleam. They were positioned on the sides of its head, giving it a wide field of vision, like prey animals have. But there was something in the way it held itself, in the stillness of its posture, that suggested it was anything but prey. For a moment that seemed to stretch far longer than the seconds it actually consumed, Williams and the creature regarded each other across the pavement. The officer's hand moved to his service revolver, muscle memory and protocol guiding his actions. He could see Shocky's patrol car further down the road, lights still flashing, painting the trees in alternating washes of red and blue. The March air was cold enough that Williams could see his own breath, but he barely noticed. Every sense was focused on the thing beside the guardrail. Then it moved. The creature rose from its crouch with a fluidity that seemed impossible for something of its build. Williams would later struggle to describe the motion accurately in his report. It wasn't quite how a human stands, pushing up from the legs. It was more like an unfolding, as if the creature's body worked on different principles of movement. And then it turned, not quickly, not in a panic, but with what seemed like deliberate purpose, and began to climb over the guardrail. This was the moment when Williams made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his career. He drew his weapon. The sound of the holster snap seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night. He could have let it go. He could have radioed in, called for more backup, watched where it went. But something in that moment, some combination of fear and duty and the sheer impossibility of what he was witnessing, made him raise the gun and fire. The gunshot cracked across the landscape, echoing off the bridge supports and the dark water of the Little Miami River below. Williams was a trained marksman, qualified on the range every 6 months like all officers in the department. At 30 feet, under normal circumstances, he rarely missed. But these were not normal circumstances. His hands were shaking, adrenaline flooding his system, and the target was moving in that strange, fluid way that made it difficult to track. The bullet struck the guardrail with a metallic ping, sending up a small spray of paint chips and rust. The creature didn't flinch. It didn't cry out or stumble, or show any of the reactions Williams might have expected from a wounded animal, or a panicked person in a costume. It simply continued its movement over the railing, with a grace that seemed entirely at odds with its awkward, hunched appearance. Williams caught a glimpse of its limbs as it maneuvered over the barrier. The back legs were powerful, bent at angles that reminded him of a frog's haunches, designed for jumping and climbing. But the front limbs, those were more developed than he would have expected, with what looked like fingers or digits that gripped the metal rail. And then it was gone, disappearing down the embankment toward the river with barely a sound. Williams stood beside his patrol car, gun still drawn, listening to the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. The smell of gunpowder hung in the cold air. Shocky was approaching now, his flashlight beam bobbing as he jogged over from his own vehicle. The two officers stood together in the darkness, looking at the guardrail, at the fresh bullet mark scarred into its surface, and then down at the dark tangle of brush and shadow where the creature had vanished. What do you put in an official police report when you've just fired your weapon at something that shouldn't exist? Williams faced this question as he sat at his desk later that night. The report formed blank before him, the weight of his responsibility pressing down on him with every word he considered. Police reports are public record. They're scrutinized, filed, sometimes pulled out years later in court cases or professional reviews. Every word matters. Every detail can be questioned. Williams chose honesty. In clear, careful handwriting, he documented the date, the time, the location along Riverside Drive. He described the creature's height, its frog-like features, the leathery texture of its skin. He noted the position of the eyes, the structure of the limbs, the way it had moved with unexpected grace over the guardrail. He documented the fact that he had discharged his weapon, the justification being the uncertain nature of the threat and the need to protect both himself and Officer Shocky. He wrote that the creature had escaped into the brush near the river, and that a search of the area had revealed no blood, no tracks, no physical evidence of its presence beyond the testimony of 2 trained law enforcement officers. The report was filed at 2:17 in the morning on March 4th, 1972. Williams signed it, Shocky corroborated it, and their supervisor accepted it with what both officers later described as visible discomfort. What else could he do? Two of his officers, both with clean records and years of reliable service, had filed identical accounts of the same impossible event. To dismiss it would be to call them liars or question their mental stability. To accept it was to acknowledge something that challenged everything rational people believed about the world. The weight of credibility matters here in ways that cannot be overstated. When a random civilian claims to have seen a monster, skepticism is easy. People misidentify animals, shadows, debris floating in water. People want attention, seek fame, enjoy the thrill of spinning a tall tale. But when a police officer files an official report, when he documents discharging his weapon in the line of duty, when he puts his career and reputation on the line for a story he knows will sound insane, the calculation changes. Williams had everything to lose and nothing to gain from this report. In 1972, law enforcement was already dealing with a crisis of public trust. The culture wars were raging. Respect for authority was eroding, and the last thing any police department needed was officers who claimed to be shooting at frog monsters in the middle of the night. Williams knew this. He knew that every traffic stop he made from that point forward, every testimony he gave in court, every interaction with the public would be colored by this report. Some would call him a liar. Others would call him crazy. His colleagues would whisper behind his back. His career trajectory, which had been solid and respectable, would forever be marked by the night he fired at something beside the guardrail. And yet he filed the report anyway. Because integrity, real integrity, means documenting the truth, even when the truth sounds impossible. It means standing by what you witnessed, even when standing by it costs you professionally and personally. Williams understood this weight, felt it settle on his shoulders as he turned in that report and walked out into the pre-dawn darkness. The official documentation created a permanent record, a paper trail that couldn't be easily dismissed or forgotten. Unlike folklore passed down through generations, softening and changing with each telling, this was contemporary testimony, filed while the memory was fresh, corroborated by two independent witnesses, part of the official record of the Loveland Police Department. It carried weight in ways that campfire stories never could. But the story doesn't end with that report, and that's what makes the March 3rd encounter so compelling in the broader narrative of the Loveland Frogmen. This wasn't the last time police would encounter something strange near those bridges. The official reports, the physical evidence in the form of that bullet scar on the guardrail, the consistent testimony of trained observers, all of it suggested that something genuinely anomalous was happening along the banks of the Little Miami River. Whatever Williams and Shockey saw that night, it was part of a larger pattern, a recurring mystery that refused to fade into the comfortable realm of discredited folklore. As Williams drove home that morning, the sun just beginning to paint the eastern sky with pale light, he passed the spot where the creature had climbed over the guardrail. The bullet mark was visible in the growing light, a small silver scar on the white paint. Physical proof that something had happened, even if no one could say exactly what. And somewhere in the brush and shadow below, along the cold waters of the Little Miami River, something moved through a world that most people never saw, leaving only questions in its wake. The night of August 5th, 2008, began like any other shift for Officer Mark Matthews. He had been with the Loveland Police Department for over a decade, accumulating thousands of hours patrolling the same familiar roads that wound through the city and along the Little Miami River. He knew every curve, every pothole, every shadowy spot where teenagers parked their cars on Friday nights. He was not the kind of man who startled easily. He had seen plenty in his years on the force, the full spectrum of human behavior at its best and absolute worst. But nothing in his training, nothing in his experience, had prepared him for what waited for him on that humid summer night. What makes Matthew's story so compelling, so deeply unsettling, is not just what he claims to have witnessed. It is the timing. Just 2 weeks had passed since Officer Scott Williams had his encounter on Riverside Drive. 14 days. And now, as Matthews drove that same stretch of road in the early morning hours, something impossible was about to repeat itself. Matthews was driving slowly, scanning the sides of the road with the practiced attention of a veteran patrol officer. The air was thick and warm, the kind of August night where everything feels suspended in amber. His headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the familiar pavement ahead. And then, suddenly, there it was. Lying in the road, directly in his path, was a creature. Matthews would later describe the jolt of recognition that shot through him when he saw it. Even in that first glimpse, even before his conscious mind could process what he was looking at, something ancient in his brain was already screaming at, this was wrong. This should not exist. The shape in the road was roughly 3 to 4 feet long, sprawled on its side, motionless. At first, Matthews thought it might be a large dog that had been struck by a car. But as his headlights illuminated the form more clearly, he realized that what he was seeing defied easy categorization. The creature had leathery skin, dark and textured in a way that seemed almost reptilian. Its body was humanoid in proportion, with defined limbs that bent at recognizable joints. But there was something profoundly alien about its configuration, something that made his eyes struggle to make sense of the angles and curves. Matthews slowed his patrol car to a stop, the headlights now fully illuminating the scene. His training kicked in automatically. Assess the situation. Determine if there is a threat. Approach with caution. He remembers thinking, in those first seconds, that the creature was dead or badly injured. It lay completely still, not even the rise and fall of breathing visible in its torso. Matthews reached for his radio, then hesitated. What would he even say? What words could describe what he was looking at? He decided he needed a closer look first, needed to understand what he was dealing with before calling it in. He opened his car door, the sound abnormally loud in the quiet night. He took one step forward, then another, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his service weapon. Not drawing it, not yet, but reassured by its presence. He was perhaps 15 feet away when everything changed. The creature moved. Not the slow, confused stirring of an injured animal. Not the gradual return to consciousness. This was instantaneous, explosive animation. One moment it was lying motionless in the road, and the next it had twisted upright with a speed that seemed to violate the laws of physics. Matthews described it as unnatural, the way it moved. Too fast, too fluid, like watching footage played at the wrong speed. The creature oriented on him immediately, and for one frozen heartbeat, they stared at each other. Matthews says he saw its face clearly in that moment. Large eyes that caught the light from his patrol car with an unsettling reflection. A mouth, or something like a mouth. Features that were almost human, almost recognizable, but skewed just enough to plunge straight into the uncanny valley. And then it moved again. The creature scrambled toward the side of the road with that same unnatural speed, moving on all fours but not like any four-legged animal Matthews had ever seen. There was something wrong about the gait, something that his brain refused to accept as natural movement. It crossed the shoulder of the road and plunged down the embankment toward the Little Miami River, moving through the brush with barely a sound. And then it was gone, swallowed by the darkness and the vegetation. Matthews stood frozen in the middle of the road, his heart hammering against his ribs. The entire encounter had lasted perhaps 30 seconds, maybe less. But in that brief window, his understanding of reality had been fundamentally shaken. He returned to his patrol car, on legs that felt uncertain beneath him. He sat in the driver's seat, his hands trembling slightly as they gripped the steering wheel. And then he did something that would later become a source of controversy and endless speculation. He called it in. His report was brief, factual, stripped of emotion. He reported seeing an unknown creature in the road, described its appearance and behavior, noted the location and time. The dispatcher, to their credit, took the report seriously. This was, after all, Loveland. The Loveland Frogmen was part of the town's identity, a piece of local folklore that everyone knew about, even if they did not quite believe in it. And now, for the second time in 2 weeks, a police officer was reporting a sighting. The parallel is what makes this case so extraordinary. 2 trained observers, both police officers with years of experience, both known for their reliability and level-headedness. 2 separate encounters, 2 weeks apart, in virtually the same location. Both describing a creature that matched the same impossible description. Bipedal, reptilian, humanoid. Large eyes, leathery skin, moving with unnatural speed and agility. What are the odds? What rational explanation can account for such precise duplication? This is where the human element becomes fascinating, where psychology intersects with the paranormal in ways that reveal as much about us as it does about the unknown. Because Matthew's story does not end with that night on Riverside Drive. What happened next is, in some ways, even more intriguing than the sighting itself. In the days following his encounter, Matthews stuck to his story. He was certain about what he had seen. He had observed the creature clearly, at close range, under the direct illumination of his patrol car's headlights. There was no ambiguity, no uncertainty. He knew what he had witnessed, and it defied conventional explanation. But as time passed, as the attention grew, as reporters began calling, and the story spread beyond Loveland's borders, something shifted. Matthews began to express doubt. He started suggesting alternative explanations, grasping for rational answers that might explain away what he had seen. And eventually, he landed on one that seemed, at least on the surface, to offer an escape from the impossible. It was an iguana, he said. What he had seen in the road that night was just a large iguana, probably someone's escaped pet, disoriented and frightened. That would explain the reptilian appearance, the leathery skin, even the somewhat humanoid proportions when viewed from certain angles. The retraction sent shock waves through the community of researchers and enthusiasts who had been following the case. An iguana? How could a trained police officer, a man who had lived his entire life in Ohio and was familiar with the local wildlife, mistake an iguana for something unknown? Iguanas, while certainly capable of growing to impressive sizes, do not move with the explosive speed Matthews had described. They do not scramble on all fours with an unnatural gait. They do not possess the kind of humanoid features that multiple witnesses across decades had reported seeing in the Loveland Frogmen. Critics of the iguana theory were quick to point out the inconsistencies. If it was simply an escaped pet iguana, why had Matthews' initial report described something so much stranger? Why had he used words like unnatural and impossible to describe its movement? Why had he been so shaken by the encounter if he had simply seen a large lizard? The iguana explanation felt less like a revelation and more like a retreat, a desperate attempt to force an inexplicable experience back into the comfortable boundaries of the known world. But here is where we must tread carefully, where we must resist the temptation to simply dismiss Matthews' retraction as weakness or dishonesty. Because what Matthews experienced in the aftermath of his sighting is something many witnesses to the paranormal describe: the weight of social pressure, the fear of ridicule, the profound cognitive dissonance that comes from having your fundamental understanding of reality challenged. When you see something that should not exist, your mind goes to war with itself. Part of you knows what you saw. Part of you refuses to accept it. And the world around you, the rational world of jobs and reputations and social standing, demands that you choose the acceptable explanation, even if it does not quite fit. Matthews was not just a witness. He was a police officer, a figure of authority whose credibility was tied to his perceived reliability and judgment. To insist that he had seen something truly unknown, something that science did not recognize, was to risk his professional reputation. It was to invite skepticism, mockery, questions about his fitness for duty. The easier path, the safer path, was to find a conventional explanation and cling to it, no matter how poorly it aligned with the actual details of his experience. So we are left with a question that has no easy answer. Does Matthew's retraction make his initial sighting less credible, or does it make it more disturbing? If we believe his first account, the one given in the immediate aftermath of the encounter when the details were fresh and the shock was still raw, then we have powerful corroboration for Williams' sighting 2 weeks earlier. We have 2 independent witnesses, both trained observers, both describing the same phenomenon in the same location. That kind of consistency is rare in paranormal research. It is the kind of evidence that demands serious consideration. But if we believe his later explanation, if we accept the iguana theory, then we must grapple with different questions. How reliable are eyewitness accounts, even from trained professionals? How much can fear and surprise distort perception? And if Matthews could be so completely mistaken about what he saw, what does that say about Williams' encounter? About all the other sightings reported over the decades? The truth, as it so often does, likely lies somewhere in the uncomfortable middle ground. Matthews saw something that night, Something was lying in that road, something that moved and scrambled toward the river. Whether it was an unknown cryptid, an unusually large iguana in an improbable location, or something else entirely, we may never know with certainty. What we do know is that his experience, combined with William's sighting 2 weeks earlier, created a moment in Loveland's history when the barrier between the known and unknown seemed terrifyingly thin. 2 officers, 2 weeks, 1 impossible creature. The mathematics of coincidence strain under that weight. The Little Miami River cuts through southwestern Ohio like a scar through limestone, its waters carrying secrets that stretch back thousands of years before the first European settlers ever set foot in the region. Long before it became known for strange amphibious creatures lurking in its depths, this river was a sacred pathway for the indigenous peoples who understood something about these waters that we may have forgotten, or perhaps something we were never meant to fully comprehend. The Shawnee called themselves the Shawanogi, the people from the south, and they knew the rivers of Ohio as living entities. Their oral traditions spoke of water spirits that inhabited every stream, every spring, every dark pool where sunlight failed to penetrate. These were not the gentle nature spirits of European fairy tales. The Shawnee water beings were transformative creatures, neither wholly benevolent nor entirely malevolent, existing in that uncomfortable space between worlds. They were shapeshifters, capable of appearing as animals, as humans, or as something that defied categorization entirely. The elders warned that certain places along the rivers were doorways, thin spots where the membrane between our world and others grew dangerously permeable. The Miami tribe, for whom the river is partially named, shared similar beliefs. Their legends described the Mishibijiu, underwater panthers that lurked in deep water, and other aquatic beings that could take many forms. But there were older stories too, whispered accounts of man-like creatures that emerged from the water on moonless nights, beings that walked on 2 legs but bore the characteristics of river animals. These were not gods to be worshipped, but phenomena to be respected, avoided when possible, and never, under any circumstances, to be followed into the water after dark. When we examine these indigenous accounts through a modern lens, we face an uncomfortable question. Were these merely mythological constructs designed to keep children away from dangerous waters? Or were the native peoples describing something they actually encountered? The Shawnee and Miami were sophisticated cultures with detailed taxonomies of the natural world. They could identify and categorize hundreds of plant and animal species. They were not prone to fantasy about their environment. When they spoke of shapeshifters in the water, they used the same matter-of-fact language they employed to describe deer, bear, or fish. The geography of southwestern Ohio offers compelling reasons why unknown creatures might persist here. The region sits atop one of the most extensive karst cave systems in the United States. Thousands of caves, many still unmapped, honeycomb the limestone bedrock beneath the Little Miami River Valley. These subterranean networks create a hidden world, complete with underground rivers, lakes, and ecosystems that remain largely unexplored. Cavity systems of this magnitude can support isolated populations of creatures for millennia, allowing species to evolve along separate paths from their surface cousins. Biologists have documented this phenomenon in other locations. Blind cave fish, colorless salamanders, and specialized invertebrates have evolved in darkness, developing characteristics that would seem alien to surface dwellers. But Ohio's caves could potentially hide something larger, something more complex. The water systems that flow through these caverns eventually connect to surface rivers. Anything living in those dark spaces would have access to the Little Miami River, emerging into our world through submerged cave openings, through drainage systems, through fissures in the riverbed that most people never notice. Consider the possibility of prehistoric amphibians, survivors from an earlier epoch of Earth's history. We know that coelacanths, fish thought extinct for 65 million years, were discovered alive in 1938. We know that new species of large animals are still being discovered in remote regions. The fossil record of Ohio reveals that massive amphibians once inhabited these waterways. The Mastodonsaurus, a creature that could grow to over 6 feet in length with a skull the size of a car tire, lived in environments not unlike the swamps and rivers of ancient Ohio. While mainstream science considers such creatures long extinct, the cave systems beneath Ohio could theoretically provide refuge for relict populations, evolutionary holdovers that found their niche and never left. But there is another theory, one that is more disturbing because it connects to documented historical facts we would prefer to forget. Ohio's rivers were sacrificed on the altar of industrial progress. From the late 1800s through the 1970s, the Little Miami River and its tributaries served as open sewers for chemical plants, manufacturing facilities, and industrial operation. The pollution was not minor. It was catastrophic, apocalyptic in scale. Witnesses described stretches of river where nothing lived, where the water ran colors not found in nature, where chemical foam accumulated in drifts along the banks like toxic snow. The Ohio Environmental Protection Agency has documented the discharge of heavy metals, industrial solvents, PCBs, and countless other compounds into these waterways during the height of industrial production. Mercury, lead, cadmium, chromium, all flowed freely into the ecosystem. We know these substances cause mutations. We have documented their effects on fish, amphibians, and aquatic mammals in controlled studies. But what we have never fully understood is the cumulative multigenerational effect of this chemical soup on creatures living in these rivers over decades. Amphibians are particularly susceptible to environmental toxins. Their permeable skin absorbs chemicals directly from the water. Their complex life cycle, involving both aquatic and terrestrial stages, exposes them to pollutants in multiple forms. Scientists have documented horrifying mutations in frogs and salamanders exposed to agricultural runoff, industrial waste, and other pollutants. Extra limbs, missing eyes, grotesque skeletal deformities. These are not theoretical possibilities, but observed realities. Now extend that reality across a century of unrestricted pollution in Ohio's waterways. Imagine not just one generation of exposed amphibians, but hundreds of generations, each adapting to increasingly toxic conditions, each developing new survival strategies, new biological pathways to cope with an environment saturated in mutagenic compound. Could something entirely new have emerged from this toxic crucible? Could the Loveland Frogmen be the result of accelerated pollution-driven evolution, creating a creature that never existed before the 20th century? The theory is uncomfortable because it makes us responsible. If the frogmen are real, if they are the product of industrial contamination, then they represent a living indictment of our treatment of the natural world. They would be evidence of damage we cannot undo, changes to the ecosystem so profound that they have created new forms of life, monstrous and strange. Some researchers propose an even more exotic explanation, the interdimensional hypothesis. This theory suggests that certain geographic locations serve as weak points in the fabric of reality, places where beings from parallel dimensions or alternate realities can cross into our world. Proponents point to the concentration of paranormal activity in the Ohio River Valley, the UFO sightings, the bizarre creature encounters, the unexplained phenomena that cluster in this region with statistical improbability. The cave systems factor into this theory as well. Underground spaces, particularly those with flowing water and unusual mineral compositions, might generate electromagnetic anomalies or other physical conditions that facilitate dimensional breaches. The Shawnee legends of thin places and doorways could be indigenous descriptions of the same phenomenon, expressed through the cultural framework available to them. In this interpretation, the frogmen are not native to our reality at all, but visitors or refugees from somewhere else, glimpsed briefly before they retreat back into whatever realm spawned them. Of course, we must also confront the most mundane explanation, that the Loveland Frogmen are nothing more than an elaborate hoax or series of misidentifications. The 1955 sighting involved a businessman whose identity was never fully verified. The 1972 police encounters could have been large iguanas or other escaped exotic pets, as one of the officers later suggested. The subsequent sightings might be the product of suggestion, people seeing what they expect to see because the legend has become embedded in local culture. But even if we accept this skeptical view, it does not fully explain why this particular legend took hold so firmly. Ohio has no shortage of rivers, caves, and industrial pollution. Yet the frogmen are specific to this location, to the Little Miami River and Loveland. Something about this place resonates with the archetype of the creature from the water, something that connects modern sightings to ancient Shawnee warnings about shapeshifters in the river. The pollution in Ohio's waterways has decreased significantly since the passage of the Clean Water Act in 1972. The Little Miami River has recovered to the point where it now supports fish populations and recreational activities. But recovery is not the same as restoration. The sediments on the riverbed still contained decades of accumulated toxins. The cave systems beneath the river still hold water that has filtered through contaminated soil. And we simply do not know what changes occurred during those dark decades when the rivers ran with poison. Biologists acknowledge that there are likely species in Ohio's waterways that have never been cataloged, particularly in the deep pools and cave systems where scientific surveys are difficult or impossible. The state's aquatic biodiversity is still being assessed. New species of cave-dwelling creatures are discovered periodically. It is entirely possible that something lives in the Little Miami River that science has not yet recognized, something that appears strange to us simply because we lack the context to understand what we are seeing. The Native American legends remind us that our ancestors, regardless of culture, understood that rivers are mysterious. They are boundaries and pathways simultaneously. They support life but can also take it. They are constants in the landscape but never the same from one moment to the next. The creatures that inhabit them move between elements, between water and land, between visibility and concealment. Perhaps the frogmen, whether real or imagined, simply represent the enduring human recognition that the water holds secrets. And some of those secrets have teeth and eyes that glow in the darkness, watching us from the shallows, while we convince ourselves that we have conquered and understood the natural world completely. Sam Jacobs had never heard of the Loveland Frogmen when he stepped out into the humid Ohio night on July 16, 2016. He was 17 years old, armed with nothing more than a smartphone and an obsession with catching virtual monsters in an augmented reality game that had taken the world by storm just weeks earlier. Pokemon Go had launched on July 6th, and like millions of other players worldwide, Sam had become captivated by the simple thrill of wandering his neighborhood in search of digital creatures overlaid on real-world locations. But on that particular Saturday night, while hunting for a rare water-type Pokemon near the shores of Lake Isabella, he would encounter something that no smartphone screen could contain. Lake Isabella sits just 3 miles from the intersection of Loveland Madeira Road and Lake Avenue, where a police officer named Ray Shockey had his legendary encounter with a bipedal frog creature back in 1972. The lake itself is modest, a recreational area surrounded by walking paths and dense clusters of trees that seem to lean toward the water, as if drawn by some ancient thirst. During the day, it's a pleasant spot for fishing and picnicking. But at night, when the streetlights barely penetrate the canopy of leaves and the water becomes an impenetrable sheet of black glass, the atmosphere shifts into something considerably less inviting. Sam had brought his friend Marcus Chen along for the Pokemon hunt. The game's interface showed a concentration of water-dwelling creatures near the eastern shore of the lake, and both teenagers had made the short drive from their homes in Loveland proper. They arrived around 9:30 in the evening, just as the last traces of twilight were surrendering to full darkness. The summer air hung thick with moisture, and the constant drone of cicadas created a wall of sound that seemed to press in from all directions. According to Sam's initial report to the Loveland Police Department, filed 3 days after the encounter, he had separated from Marcus by roughly 50 yards as they followed different paths along the shoreline. Marcus had headed toward a cluster of Pokestops near the boat launch, while Sam moved eastward, his eyes fixed on his phone screen where a particularly coveted Lapras had appeared on his nearby radar. He was walking slowly, dividing his attention between the uneven path and the glowing screen in his hand, when his phone suddenly froze. Technology fails at the worst possible moments, and Sam looked up in frustration, intending to restart the application. That's when he saw it. Standing at the water's edge, approximately 20 feet away, was a creature unlike anything he had ever seen outside of a science fiction film. In his statement, Sam described it as roughly 4 feet tall, with grayish-green skin that appeared wet or slimy in the dim light from the distant parking lot. The creature stood on 2 legs in a posture that was distinctly upright, almost human in its bearing, but the proportions were entirely wrong. The legs were too thick, too muscular, bending at angles that suggested a frog's powerful haunches rather than human anatomy. But it was the head that locked Sam in place, that sent ice water flooding through his veins despite the summer heat. The creature's head was wide and flat, with a mouth that seemed to stretch impossibly across its face. Even in the poor lighting, Sam could make out the distinctive bulge of what appeared to be large, protruding eyes positioned on the sides of its skull. The thing was looking out across the water, seemingly unaware of Sam's presence, or perhaps simply unconcerned by the teenage observer. Sam would later tell investigators that the entire sighting lasted no more than 8 to 10 seconds, though in the moment it felt like minutes. He stood frozen, his malfunctioning phone forgotten in his hand, watching this impossible creature as his rational mind struggled to supply an explanation. A person in a costume? Someone's idea of a prank? But the movements seemed too fluid, too organic. When the creature shifted its weight from one leg to the other, Sam could see muscle moving beneath the skin, could observe the subtle adjustments of balance that suggested genuine anatomy, rather than someone shuffling around inside a rubber suit. Then, as if sensing his attention, the creature turned its head in Sam's direction. That single motion broke the spell of paralysis. Sam stumbled backward, his foot catching on an exposed root, and in the half-second it took him to regain his balance, the creature moved. It didn't walk or run into the water. Instead, it executed a single powerful leap, launching itself forward in an arc that carried it several feet from shore before disappearing beneath the surface with a splash that seemed far too small for a creature of its apparent mass. The ripples spread outward in perfect circles, glittering in the distant light, and then there was nothing. Only dark water and the relentless chorus of insects. Sam ran to. He found Marcus near the parking lot and insisted they leave immediately, offering no explanation until they were safely in the car with the doors locked. Even then, the story came out in fragments, broken pieces that Marcus initially dismissed as an attempt at humor. It wasn't until Marcus saw the genuine fear in his friend's eyes that he realized Sam was serious. They drove to Sam's house, where they spent the next several hours searching online for any explanation that might make sense of what Sam had witnessed. That's when they discovered the history. Article after article detailing the Loveland Frogman sightings from 1955 and 1972. The descriptions matched what Sam had seen with unsettling precision. The upright posture, the frog-like features, the location near water, and most significantly, the way the creature had entered the water when discovered. Officer Mark Matthews, in his 1972 report, had described how the creature he struck with his vehicle had climbed over the guardrail and lowered itself into the Little Miami River. Ray Shockey had watched his frogman cross the road and descend the embankment toward the same river. And now, 44 years later, Sam Jacobs had witnessed another creature of identical description vanish into Lake Isabella. Sam's decision to file a police report was not made lightly. He and Marcus debated it for 3 days, fully aware of how the story would sound, especially given the circumstances. By mid-July of 2016, Pokémon Go had already generated its share of controversy and bizarre news stories. Players walking into traffic, trespassing on private property, getting injured while staring at their phones instead of watching where they walk. The media had latched onto these stories with gleeful enthusiasm, painting the game and its players as symptoms of technology-addicted youth, losing touch with reality. Sam knew exactly how his report would be received. Teenager playing Pokémon Go claims to see monster. The Pokémon connection would poison any credibility his account might otherwise have possessed. It was ready-made comedy material for late-night talk shows and internet mockery. But Sam also felt a responsibility to document what he had seen, regardless of the personal cost. On July 19, 2016, he walked into the Loveland Police Department and filed his statement. The response was predictably mixed. The officer who took his report was professional, but clearly skeptical. The local media, when they eventually picked up the story in late July, treated it with barely concealed amusement. Headlines like Pokémon Go player catches more than he bargained for, and gotta catch 'em all, including Cryptids, treated the sighting as a curiosity rather than a serious report. Internet commenters were less kind, suggesting everything from attention-seeking behavior to drug use. But a smaller group took notice with considerably more interest. Cryptozoology researchers and Loveland Frogman enthusiasts recognized immediately that Sam's description aligned perfectly with the historical accounts. More significantly, investigators discovered that Sam had no prior knowledge of the Frogman legend before his sighting. His internet search history confirmed that he had never looked up the Loveland Frogman, never researched local cryptids, never visited any of the websites devoted to the creature. He was, by all accounts, a genuine witness describing something he saw without any preconceived expectations of what he should be seeing. Debbie Goddard, a folklorist from Cincinnati who had been studying the Frogmen reports for over a decade, drove to Loveland to interview Sam personally. She brought with her a collection of sketches and descriptions from the earlier sightings, carefully avoiding leading questions or suggesting what Sam should have seen. His account remained consistent across multiple interviews, and the details he provided matched elements from reports he could not possibly have known about. He mentioned the creature's hands, for instance, describing them as webbed with longer fingers than a human hand, but shorter than he expected frog feet to be. This matched details from the 1955 sighting that had never been widely publicized. The 2016 sighting forced researchers to confront a pattern they had long suspected but never definitively confirmed. The Loveland Frogmen sightings came in clusters separated by significant gaps of time. 1955, then nothing until 1972, then silence for 44 years until 2016. This pattern suggested something far stranger than a simple case of misidentified animals or ongoing hoaxes. If these were pranks, why the decades-long gaps? If these were real creatures, where did they go between sightings? The water connection became impossible to ignore. Every credible Frogman sighting involved the creature either emerging from or retreating into water. The Little Miami River in the early cases, now Lake Isabella. The witnesses consistently described the creatures entering the water with purpose and confidence, disappearing completely beneath the surface. This raised questions that troubled even skeptical investigators. What lives in those dark waters? What could survive there, unseen, for years or even decades between rare appearances? Lake Isabella is not particularly deep, reaching a maximum depth of only about 30 feet, but it connects through a series of channels and drainage systems to the Little Miami River watershed. The river itself runs for over 100 miles, with countless tributaries, underground springs, and unexplored caverns feeding into its system. The limestone geology of southwestern Ohio creates extensive underground water networks, dark arteries of flowing water that humans have barely mapped, let alone explored. If something wanted to remain hidden in that subterranean world, emerging only rarely into the surface waters that humans frequent, it would have millions of gallons of dark, secret spaces in which to hide. Sam Jacobs is 25 years old now. He rarely speaks publicly about his sighting, having endured enough mockery to last a lifetime. But he has never recanted his story, never suggested he was mistaken or exaggerating. He knows what he saw standing at the water's edge that July night. And sometimes, late at night, he still wonders what might have happened if his phone hadn't frozen, if he had walked past that spot 10 seconds earlier or later, if the creature had decided to approach rather than flee. He wonders what else might be watching from the darkness, waiting for the right moment to surface again. The kayak cut through the dark water like a whisper, barely disturbing the glassy surface of the Little Miami River as the sun dipped below the tree line. It was late September of 2019, and Marcus Chen had been paddling this section of river for almost 3 years, always timing his trips to catch the last golden hour of daylight. He loved the way the world transformed at dusk, how the familiar became something else entirely, how the shadows stretched long across the water, and the sounds of the day gave way to the chorus of evening. But on this particular Thursday, as his paddle dipped rhythmically into the current about 2 miles upstream from the Morrow boat ramp, something happened that would not only end his kayaking hobby forever, but would also provide the most disturbing and physically direct encounter with the entities that have haunted the Little Miami River Valley for decades. Marcus was an experienced paddler, someone who understood the river's moods and movements, who could read the current and navigate the shallows without thinking. At 34 years old, he worked as a software engineer in Cincinnati, and the river had become his escape from screens and code, and the constant hum of digital life. He knew every bend of this particular stretch, every sandbar and eddy, every place where the sycamores leaned out over the water, and the kingfishers made their diving runs. The section he was paddling that evening was one of his favorites, a relatively straight run where the river widened slightly, and the current moved with gentle insistence toward the Ohio River confluence miles downstream. The light was fading faster than usual, he would later recall. The sky had turned that particular shade of deep blue that seems to absorb color rather than reflect it, and the surface of the river had become almost black except where the last rays of sun caught the ripples. He had maybe 20 minutes of usable light left, enough time to make it back to the ramp without needing his headlamp. The air temperature had dropped noticeably, and he remembers thinking about the cold front that was supposed to move through overnight, wondering if this might be his last paddle before the weather turned for good. He was in mid-stroke when it happened. His paddle was fully extended on the right side, blade submerged perhaps 2 feet deep, pulling through the water with the automatic precision of thousands of previous strokes. And then suddenly, without warning, the paddle stopped moving. Not gradually, not as if it had hit a submerged log or caught on river debris. It stopped completely, as though it had been seized by something with deliberate intent and tremendous strength. Marcus pulled harder, thinking he had snagged something, but the paddle would not budge. Then he felt it, the sensation that would replay in his nightmares for months afterward. Through the carbon fiber shaft of the paddle, he felt movement. Not the random bump of river debris, but something that felt unmistakably like a grip adjusting, like fingers, or something resembling fingers repositioning themselves around the blade. The paddle moved slightly, perhaps 6 inches to the left, with a force that nearly pulled him out of the kayak. He yanked back instinctively, putting his full body weight into it, and for a moment there was resistance, genuine resistance, as if he had entered into a tug of war with something beneath the surface. The kayak rocked violently, water splashing over the sides, and Marcus felt a spike of adrenaline that made his vision sharpen and his heart hammer against his ribs. He pulled again, harder this time, and whatever had hold of the paddle seemed to pull back with equal force, drawing the kayak forward several feet against the current. Then the surface broke. What Marcus saw in those next seconds would fundamentally alter his relationship with natural spaces, with water, with the comfortable assumption that humans occupy the top of the food chain in familiar environments. The thing that emerged from the river approximately 8 feet from the front of his kayak was not a fish, not a turtle, not a beaver or river otter, or any creature he had ever seen or could have imagined. It was a face, and that word itself seems insufficient to describe what he encountered. It was a humanoid face in the most unsettling sense, possessing bilateral symmetry and features that his brain wanted to categorize as eyes, nose, mouth, but arranged and proportioned in a way that violated every expectation. The eyes were the worst part, he would later say. They were massive, occupying perhaps a third of the visible face, dark and reflective like obsidian spheres, with no visible iris or pupil that he could detect in the failing light. They were positioned slightly too far apart, giving the face an alien geometry, and they caught the last rays of sunlight in a way that made them seem to glow with their own internal luminescence. The skin, if it could be called that, was slick and smooth, appearing almost translucent, with a greenish-gray coloration that seemed to shift in the water. It reflected light like wet stone, and Marcus could see what looked like a network of darker veins or channels just beneath the surface. The creature held his gaze for perhaps 3 seconds, though Marcus insists it felt like much longer, like time had stretched and warped in that moment of impossible confrontation. There was intelligence in those eyes, he maintains, something that went beyond animal awareness. It was looking at him, studying him, evaluating him with an intentionality that was somehow worse than simple predatory interest. The face was large. He estimates it was comparable in size to a basketball, suggesting a body of substantial proportions beneath the dark water. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature released the paddle. Marcus felt the tension disappear, felt the blade become free in the water, and in the same instant, the face sank beneath the surface without a splash, without any disturbance that would indicate something of that size submerging. It simply descended back into the darkness, as if it had never been there at all, leaving only ripples that quickly disappeared in the current. For a moment, Marcus sat frozen, his paddle still extended, his breath coming in short gasps, his mind trying to process what had just occurred. The rational part of his brain was already working overtime, trying to find explanations, cataloging possibilities. Could it have been a large fish? A deformed turtle? Some trick of the light and his own fatigue creating illusions from ordinary river phenomena? But even as these thoughts formed, He knew they were inadequate. He knew what he had seen. He knew what he had felt through the paddle shaft. This had been a living creature of substantial size and strength that had deliberately grabbed his paddle and then revealed itself, making what could only be interpreted as direct eye contact before releasing him and disappearing. The panic hit him then, delayed but overwhelming. His hands were shaking so badly, he nearly dropped the paddle as he swung it to the other side and began stroking back toward the boat ramp with desperate, inefficient movements that splashed water everywhere. He kept looking behind him, convinced he would see that face emerge again, feel something grab the kayak from below, experience the horrifying sensation of being pulled under into the dark water where those massive eyes waited. Every piece of river debris became a potential threat, every shadow on the water's surface a source of terror. The 2-mile paddle back to the ramp took on the quality of a nightmare, where distance refuses to close and safety remains perpetually out of reach. He paddled harder than he had ever paddled before, his shoulders burning, his breath ragged, making elementary mistakes that he had not made since he was a beginner. The kayak weaved erratically, and twice he nearly capsized himself in his panicked haste. The light continued to fade, and the river grew darker, and with every passing minute, he became more convinced that something was pacing him beneath the surface, tracking his movement, deciding whether to make contact again. When he finally reached the boat ramp, he dragged his kayak onto the concrete with such force that he heard something crack in the hull. His truck was the only vehicle in the small gravel parking lot, and he loaded his gear with fumbling, inefficient movements, constantly glancing back at the water, expecting to see ripples approaching the shore, or those massive eyes watching from the shallows. He threw the kayak onto his roof rack without properly securing it, and drove the first 3 miles with his high beams on and his windows up, despite the fact that he was nowhere near the water. The reluctance to report what happened came almost immediately. Marcus Chen was not someone prone to flights of fancy or supernatural interpretations of natural events. He had a degree in computer science from a respected university, worked in a field that demanded logical thinking and empirical evidence. How could he possibly explain to anyone what he had experienced without sounding unhinged? Who would believe that something with a humanoid face and massive intelligent eyes had grabbed his kayak paddle from beneath the Little Miami River? What authorities would he even contact? And what would they do with such a report besides file it away as the ramblings of someone who had spent too much time in the sun? He told his girlfriend that evening, and her reaction confirmed his fears. She listened with increasing skepticism, suggested he had been tired, mentioned that lighting at dusk could be tricky, pointed out that fish could grow quite large and might appear strange when seen partially. Her explanations were reasonable and kind, but they felt like dismissals, like gentle attempts to redirect him back to consensus reality. He did not bring it up again. In the days that followed, Marcus researched extensively, trying to find similar accounts, looking for any documented creature that might match what he had seen. He found references to river monsters and lake cryptids, stories of strange sightings along various waterways, but nothing that quite captured the specific horror of that humanoid face with its impossibly large eyes. He discovered old legends from the Shawnee and other indigenous peoples about water spirits and underwater beings, stories that white settlers had dismissed as primitive superstition. He read about the Loveland Frogmen, about various accounts of strange entities near the Little Miami and other Ohio rivers, and he realized that his experience, while unique in its physical directness, was not entirely unprecedented. 3 weeks after the incident, Marcus sold his kayak on an online marketplace. He listed it at a price below market value and accepted the first offer that came through, wanting it gone, wanting to eliminate the physical reminder of what had happened. The buyer asked him why he was selling such nice equipment, and Marcus said he was moving away, which was not technically true, but felt safer than the reality. He has not been back to the Little Miami River since that September evening in 2019. He has not kayaked anywhere, has not even gone fishing, has avoided bodies of water with an intensity that his friends find puzzling and somewhat concerning. The specific section of river where the encounter occurred, the straight stretch about 2 miles upstream from the Morrow boat ramp, holds a particular dread for him. He has driven past it a few times when traveling on nearby roads, and each time he finds himself accelerating, unwilling to look at the water for more than a few seconds, remembering that moment when the paddle stopped moving, and something beneath the surface decided to make its presence known. He thinks about the strength that would have been required to grab and hold a kayak paddle against his full effort to pull it free. He thinks about the size of the face that broke the surface, and what body must have been attached to it in the murky depth. He thinks about the intelligence he saw in those eyes, the sense of being evaluated by something that lived in a world parallel to human civilization, but fundamentally separate from it. This account, shared reluctantly with only a handful of people who promised confidentiality before Marcus finally agreed to let it be documented anonymously, represents the only known instance of potential physical contact with the entities that allegedly inhabit the Little Miami River Valley. Every other sighting, every other encounter, has been observational, witnesses seeing something strange on the shore or in the water, but never experiencing direct interaction. Marcus Chen felt that interaction through the shaft of his paddle, saw intention in those massive eyes, and it terrified him so thoroughly that he has restructured his entire recreational life to avoid the possibility of ever experiencing it again. The implications are what keep him awake sometimes, even now, years after the incident. If something that size and strength exists in a recreational river that thousands of people paddle and fish every year, why are encounters so rare? Is it simply that the creatures, whatever they are, prefer to remain hidden? Or is it that most people who have encountered them have chosen silence as Marcus initially did, unwilling to face the ridicule and skepticism that such accounts inevitably generate? How many other kayakers, how many other river users have felt something grab their paddle or their anchor line and chosen to interpret it as debris or imagination, rather than accept the more disturbing possibility? And perhaps most chilling of all is the question of intent. The creature that grabbed Marcus's paddle could have capsized him easily, could have pulled him into the water if it had wished to do so. Instead, it held the paddle, revealed itself, made eye contact, and then released him and disappeared. Was this a warning? A message? Simple curiosity from an intelligence we cannot comprehend? Marcus does not know, and the not knowing is perhaps worse than any answer could be. He only knows that something in the Little Miami River looked at him with eyes too large and too knowing, and that he will never feel safe on dark water again. The Little Miami River flows through Loveland, Ohio, just as it always has. The water moves in the darkness beneath the bridges, catching the reflection of streetlights and the occasional headlights of cars passing overhead. Fishermen still cast their lines into its depths. Kayakers still navigate its currents. And yet, across more than 60 years of sightings and encounters, not a single piece of physical evidence has ever been recovered. No bodies have been found. No bones have been pulled from the riverbed. No clear photograph has ever emerged that could settle the question once and for all. The creature, if it exists, has left behind nothing but stories and the unshakable conviction of those who claim to have seen it. This absence of evidence presents perhaps the deepest mystery of the Loveland Frogman legend. In an age where nearly everyone carries a camera in their pocket, where wildlife cameras monitor remote forests, where DNA analysis can identify species from a single hair, the frogman remains stubbornly absent from the physical record. Skeptics point to this vacuum as proof that nothing was ever there. But believers argue that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and that the consistency of the reports across decades suggests something real lurking in the shadows. The questions multiply the longer you examine them. Why do credible witnesses, separated by years and sometimes decades, describe essentially the same impossible creature? Why do the sightings always occur near water? And why does the Little Miami River specifically seem to draw these encounters? What are we make of Officer Matthews' retraction, which paradoxically makes some investigators more convinced that something genuine happened, something that authorities wanted dismissed and forgotten? The legend refuses to die, and perhaps that itself tells us something. The dark water still flows. The bridges still span the river. And somewhere in Ohio tonight, someone might be driving across one of those bridges, glancing down at the water below, wondering what might be waiting there in the darkness. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.